Thomas, a small blue tank engine with a cheery whistle and big dreams, rolled along the tracks toward Sodier. He'd heard stories of the bustling railways, grand engines, and, most importantly, of the work that lay ahead of him. His ambition? To become a really useful engine. Upon his arrival, Thomas was greeted by Sir Topham Hatt, the railway director. Sir Topham Hatt explained the importance of being reliable, responsible, and helpful to all engines on the railway. With excitement shining in his eyes, Thomas nodded eagerly. He was ready to get to work, though he quickly learned it would be harder than he thought. Thomas was initially assigned simple jobs delivering coal, pulling empty freight cars, and learning to navigate Sodier's busy tracks. Each day, he watched in awe as big engines like Gordon and James thundered down the lines with heavy passenger trains. He tried to talk to them, hoping to impress them, but they often brushed him off. "You're only a small tank engine," Gordon would huff. "It takes more than enthusiasm to be really useful." Determined, Thomas worked harder. He took every opportunity to prove himself, pushing through challenges with a smile, though some of the bigger engines still weren't convinced. One foggy morning, Thomas was given a chance to work at the shunting yard. He was thrilled. But as he bustled about, sorting trucks and moving cars, he accidentally caused a collision. Freight cars derailed, and the yard became a mess. Thomas felt terrible, worried he'd never become a really useful engine now. But Sir Topham Hatt didn't scold Thomas. Instead, he offered kind advice. "Thomas, every engine makes mistakes, what matters is that you learn from them and keep trying." Thomas felt better, realizing that he didn't have to be perfect right away. With renewed focus, he vowed to learn and grow, even if it took time. One stormy night, a big passenger train was stranded on the main line. Gordon, who was supposed to pull the train, had broken down, and no other engine was nearby. Without hesitation, Thomas volunteered to help. With all his strength, Thomas chugged through the rain to the stranded passengers. Though small, he was determined. He carefully pulled the train back to the station, never faltering in his effort. He arrived, everyone cheered for Thomas's bravery. Sir Topham Hatt smiled warmly and said, "Thomas, you've shown true courage and dedication. You've proven that even a small engine can be really useful." From that day on, Thomas became a valued member of the railway family. He learned that being a really useful engine wasn't about size or strength, but about heart and perseverance. And though he was still small, he had a big role to play on Sodium, one that made him prouder every day. Thomas was proud of his new role on the branch line. He had worked hard to earn it, taking care to be on time and to keep his passengers happy. He loved the winding track, the small stations, and all the sights he passed along the way. But there were still things he had to learn, especially with winter coming. One chilly morning, Thomas woke to find a thick blanket of snow covering the tracks. He shivered but felt excited to get started, certain that he could handle it. He even thought of himself as brave, like Gordon or James. But as he puffed through the snow, Thomas realized it was more challenging than he'd thought. His wheels slipped, and he struggled to stop at stations. "Take it slow, Thomas," his driver advised. But Thomas was determined to stick to his schedule. He kept up his pace, hoping he wouldn't disappoint his passengers. Thomas's determination was strong, but the snow kept making things tricky. He skidded on the icy rails and struggled with the slippery hills. Then, as he approached a steep incline, he tried to go too fast and whoosh! He slipped backward, landing in a soft snowdrift at the bottom of the hill. "Oh no!" Thomas cried. His face was half buried in snow, and his cheeks turned pink with embarrassment. He worried he would let down Sir Topham Hatt and his passengers, but luckily, his friends Percy and Toby soon arrived to help dig him out. "Slow and steady wins the race, Thomas," Percy teased, but he and Toby were both happy to help him back onto the tracks. A few days later, Thomas felt he was getting better at handling the snow. But one morning, as he was picking up his passengers at the station, Bertie the bus pulled up beside him with a cheeky grin. "Care for a race, Thomas?" Bertie teased. Thomas knew he was supposed to focus on safety, especially in winter, but he couldn't resist the challenge. "You're on, Bertie," he called back with a toot of his whistle. The two friends sped off, Thomas chugging faster than ever. He darted along the icy tracks, determined to keep up with Bertie. But as he rounded a sharp bend, his wheels slipped again, and this time he skidded right into a snowdrift. Covered from funnel to buffers in snow, Thomas had to admit that racing in winter was not his best idea. After his snowy mishaps, Thomas realized he had a lot to learn about winter weather. Sir Topham Hatt gently reminded him, a really useful engine knows when to go fast and when to go carefully. Thomas took the advice to heart. From then on, he practiced moving slowly and steadily, even on the coldest days. He learned how to approach icy patches with caution, stop gently at snowy platforms, and listen to his driver's guidance. When winter finally gave way to spring, Thomas was a wiser engine, grateful for the lessons he'd learned. He'd faced the snow and his racing urges, and he knew he'd grown a lot on his branch line. As he chugged through the warmer air, Thomas whistled happily, knowing he was becoming the really useful engine he always wanted to be.
Thomas had only been gone from the main line a short while, but his absence was already felt by the big engines. Gordon, Henry, and James had grown used to having Thomas around to help them with shunting and organizing their trains. Now that he was busy running his branch line, they had to manage these tasks on their own, and they weren't pleased about it. "Shunting is undignified," grumbled Gordon one morning, as he reluctantly backed into a row of trucks. "Thomas should be doing this, not us." "And look at these dirty trucks," Henry added, wrinkling his nose. "I'm meant for pulling big loads, not pushing smelly coal wagons." James just sighed, trying to keep his shiny red paint clean. "It's just not fair," he complained. "Thomas always made this look so easy." But Thomas wasn't there, and the big engines had no choice but to handle things themselves. One day, Gordon was feeling particularly put out about shunting. "I am the express engine," he huffed to himself. "This is no job for me." After a tiring morning, Gordon was finally assigned to pull a passenger train. He puffed out of the station, relieved to be back doing what he loved. But as he passed through the countryside, something strange happened. A herd of elephants had wandered onto the tracks. Gordon screeched to a halt, his eyes wide as the elephants blocked his way. The passengers peered out of the windows in surprise and delight, but Gordon was horrified. "I'm a dignified engine, not a safari guide," he muttered. It took some time for the elephants to be safely cleared away, and by the time Gordon returned to the sheds, he was grumbling more than ever about missing Thomas. Henry's frustrations didn't end there. One afternoon, he was tasked with pulling a long train of troublesome trucks. The trucks, notorious for their mischief, decided they were going to have some fun with Henry. They bumped and bashed him all the way down the line. As Henry tried to manage the unruly trucks, there was a loud crash. One of the coupling rods snapped, and Henry was left stranded on the line. A quick-thinking guard borrowed a bootlace from a passenger to temporarily fix the brake so Henry could limp back to the sheds. Henry was embarrassed beyond words. "If only Thomas were here," he sighed, remembering how Thomas was always quick to help with troublesome trucks. Later, James found himself with his own problems. Without Thomas to help shunt, he was rushing to prepare his coaches on his own. In his haste, he bumped into a coach, scratching his bright red paint. This upset him so much that he didn't notice when he started pulling the train without properly checking his brakes. Halfway down the line, his brakes failed completely, and James sped down the track in a panic until the signalman diverted him onto a safe siding, where he finally came to a stop. James, now shaken and a little scratched, muttered, "Thomas always made it look so easy." When the big engines returned to the sheds that evening, each of them had a story to tell. Gordon grumbled about elephants, Henry fumed over bootlaces, and James was upset about his scratched paint. They all agreed that things had been much simpler when Thomas was around to help. Sir Topham Hatt, who had overheard their complaints, chuckled. "It seems you all miss Thomas more than you realized," he said. "Perhaps you'll appreciate him a little more when you see him next." The big engines nodded, each one quietly promising to be a bit kinder the next time they saw Thomas. After all, they'd come to realize that a really useful engine, no matter how small, was always worth appreciating. The big engines, Gordon, Henry, and James, had reached their limit. Shunting, in their opinion, was beneath them. They were express engines, built to haul important trains, not to push and pull trucks around the yard like little engines. And they were still sore about Thomas leaving to run his branch line. One morning, as they gathered in the sheds, Gordon took charge. "This is ridiculous. We should stand up for ourselves." Henry nodded. "We're meant for big jobs, not for fussing with trucks." "Right," agreed James, his red paint gleaming in indignation. "We'll go on strike until Sir Topham Hatt gives us proper respect." And so, they did. Gordon, Henry, and James stayed stubbornly in the sheds, refusing to move a single truck or coach. The railway soon became a mess, with trains delayed and passengers complaining. But the big engines didn't budge. They were determined to show Sir Topham Hatt they meant business. When Sir Topham Hatt heard of the strike, he was both amused and annoyed. The big engines thought they were making a grand stand, but he knew just what to do to bring them back in line. He decided to bring in a new engine, a small green tank engine with a cheeky smile, named Percy. Percy arrived at Knapford Station the next day, looking around eagerly at his new home. He was bright-eyed, curious, and eager to prove himself, even if it meant shunting. "Hello, sir." Percy greeted Sir Topham Hatt with a cheerful whistle. "Welcome, Percy," Sir Topham Hatt replied warmly. "I have a special job for you. The big engines are refusing to shunt, so I need someone reliable who's willing to work hard." Percy's face lit up. "I'd love to help, sir." Without hesitation, Percy set to work, organizing trucks and preparing trains. He darted around the yard, moving faster than Gordon, Henry, or James ever had, whistling happily all the while. Soon, Percy had the yard running smoothly again. Back in the sheds, Gordon, Henry, and James had expected their strike to disrupt the railway, but they were surprised when everything continued as normal. Curious, they peered out to see Percy busy shunting and moving trucks with ease. "Who's that?" James huffed, surprised. "I don't know," Gordon replied, frowning, "but he's not half bad at shunting." The big engines watched as Percy zipped around the yard, smiling and chatting with the other engines. Despite their grumpiness, they had to admit that Percy seemed to enjoy his work. Henry finally sighed, looking guilty. "Maybe we've been too proud," he muttered. "Even little engines like shunting." When Sir Topham Hatt saw the big engines watching Percy, he decided it was time for a talk. He approached them, crossing his arms. "Gordon, Henry, James," he began sternly, "I hope you see now that every job on this railway is important. Even shunting helps keep things running smoothly." The big engines looked at one another, realizing they'd let their pride get in the way of being really useful engines. They hung their heads, embarrassed. "Percy here has shown that there's no job too small for an engine who wants to help," Sir Topham Hatt continued. "I expect each of you to work alongside him from now on, sharing the duties." Though reluctant, the big engines agreed. Over the next few days, they helped Percy with the shunting and learned to appreciate the hard work involved. They even started to respect Percy, who was always cheerful and willing to lend a hand. As the days went by, Percy became a valued member of the team. The big engines came to see him as a friend, realizing he brought energy and enthusiasm that the railway needed. Even Gordon, who once believed shunting was beneath him, found himself impressed with Percy's determination. Soon, Percy was well loved by all the engines, big and small. And though the big engines sometimes grumbled, they never went on strike again, remembering the lesson Percy had taught them, that every job on the railway was important. And so, the big engines had not only gained a new friend but had also learned a bit of humility along the way. Percy was always willing to help, especially when it came to showing the big engines he was just as useful as they were. So, when Sir Topham Hatt asked him to assist in repairing an old tunnel, Percy was excited to pitch in. The tunnel had been damaged during a recent storm, and parts of it were unstable. Percy's job was to pull out debris and help clear the line. At first, everything went smoothly, and Percy was enjoying himself. But as he chugged deeper into the tunnel, pulling loaded trucks of rubble, he began to notice how dark it was inside. "Keep going, Percy," his driver encouraged. "We're almost done." But just then, with a loud crash, part of the tunnel ceiling gave way, and rocks tumbled down, blocking the entrance. Before he knew it, Percy was trapped inside. As the last bits of daylight disappeared behind the rockfall, Percy's firebox flickered nervously. He was all alone in the darkness, and it was eerily quiet. Though Percy was usually cheerful and brave, the pitch-black tunnel filled him with fear. "Hello," Percy stammered, his voice echoing through the empty space. He tried to stay calm, but the shadows seemed to close in around him. Percy's wheels trembled, and he couldn't help but feel very small and scared. Outside, Sir Topham Hatt quickly learned about the collapse and Percy's predicament. He rushed to gather the other engines, explaining the situation. "We need to get Percy out, and fast," Sir Topham Hatt said. "He must be frightened in there all alone." Thomas, Gordon, James, and even Henry immediately volunteered to help. Each one of them was worried about Percy, especially knowing how dark it must be in the tunnel. "I know how he feels," Henry said quietly. "I once got bricked up in a tunnel, and it was awful." "Then we'd better hurry," Thomas said. "Percy's counting on us." The engines formed a plan. Thomas and James would start clearing the rubble from one end of the tunnel, while Henry and Gordon worked from the other. With their combined strength, they hoped to reach Percy quickly. As they worked, Thomas called out through the rocks, hoping Percy could hear him. "Hang on, Percy. We're coming." Inside the tunnel, Percy was still feeling anxious. But then, faintly, he heard Thomas's whistle echo through the darkness. It was like a ray of hope piercing through his fear. "Thomas," Percy called, his voice quivering. "Is that you?" "Yes, Percy. We're on our way to get you out. Just keep your firebox warm, and don't worry." Hearing Thomas's voice gave Percy courage. He focused on keeping his fire burning and took deep breaths, trying to calm himself as the other engines worked hard to clear the debris. After hours of digging, Thomas and James finally broke through the last layer of rock. Sunlight streamed into the tunnel, and there was Percy, his face lighting up with relief as he saw his friends. Thomas. James. "Oh, thank you," Percy exclaimed, his voice full of gratitude. Thomas and James gave him comforting smiles, and they slowly led Percy out of the tunnel and into the open air, where Sir Topham Hatt and the other engines were waiting. Percy took a deep breath of fresh air, grateful to be free from the dark. "Well done, Percy," Sir Topham Hatt praised. "You were very brave, even when things were difficult." Percy blushed. "Thank you, sir. I was scared, but knowing my friends were there helped me be brave." That evening, the engines gathered around Percy, listening to his story of the dark tunnel and offering their support. Even Gordon, who was usually proud, told Percy he'd done a good job. Thomas gave Percy an encouraging bump. "You're one of us, Percy. We'll always be there when you need us." Percy beamed with pride, knowing he had friends he could rely on. And though he still didn't like the dark, he felt braver than ever, knowing he was never truly alone.